All right. Thank you all for joining us today for our webinar. Today, we'll be discussing the ins and outs of DRM, beginning with the fundamentals and covering niche and challenging components, like how and why to track your data down. Today, we'll be joined by our partners over at Ground Labs. So let me tell you a little bit about our host organizations. Ground Labs enables organizations to discover and remediate all of their data across multiple types and locations on servers, on desktops, and in the cloud. Ground Labs takes the guesswork out of compliance. Their solutions, Enterprise Recon and Card Recon, empowers organizations to meet and adhere to an ever-changing state of global and regional regulations, including GDPR, PCI DSS, CCPA, HIPAA, and Australian privacy. If you would like to learn more, you could do so by visiting the link on this slide. Next, we'll talk about RSI security. RSI Security is a premier managed IT security and compliance advisory service provider. We have professionals for all cybersecurity and compliance needs, from data privacy to PCI, healthcare data compliance, cyber defense, penetration testing, federal programs, and more. These are some of the services we specialize in as a full suite cybersecurity solution provider. We work with some of the world's leading companies, institutions, and governments to ensure the safety of their information and their compliance with applicable regulations. Now I will introduce to you our panelists. We can move to the next slide. Thank you. Yad is Ground Labs head of product marketing. He recently joined the company to drive product and go-to-market strategy for Enterprise Recon, their market-leading data discovery solution. Yad has more than 20 years experience working in product marketing for a variety of technology vendors in the US, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific regions. Most recently, Yad was at Netcall working on delivering automation technologies through future software development. Yad is excited about the near future and the improvements that help make data work for rather than against the enterprise. Next, we have Mohan. Mohan has over 20 years of experience in information technology infrastructure, management, and cybersecurity. He's a high trust assessor, PCI DSS QSA, and a certified information privacy professional. He has performed compliance, security assessments, and advisory on multiple security and compliance standards for numerous organizations across many industries. Before I pass it off to Mohan, I would like to go over a few FAQs. First, any questions you have throughout the presentation, please feel free to use that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screne. Be sure to use the Q&A button to submit all your questions throughout the presentation and at the end. Also, you will receive a copy of the presentation, a CPE certificate, and a recording via email tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that. I will now pass it over to Mohan to take it away.
Thank you, Nico. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to join Yad from Ground Labs today to talk about data risk management.
Nice to be here. Thank you, Mohan. Good to be working with you today.
Same here. Thank you. So we have a agenda for this session. We're going to talk about what are data risks. So just a quick introduction about data risks, and then why data risk management, what we abbreviate that to as DRM. So the importance of DRM, and then a few pointers to how to perform data risk management, and what are some of the details around the data risk management. And again, so we're going to go back and forth between the importance and how to in our slides. And then finally, we'll open up for QA as to what are some of the services and what you need to do from a security and from a compliance point of view to ensure that you have the data risk management practice in place at your organization. So we can go to the next slide. So let me sort of introduce data risks. As everybody probably have heard this, data is the new oil. And it is very true. Data is a very critical, very valuable asset. Lots of bad things can go on around data. So if you take a hospital environment, if you do not have accurate data, think about it, the impact of not having good data to treat the patients. Of course, the outcome can be pretty fatal. So that is one example of how important data is. So I have sort of categorized three wrongs that can go on to add to the data risk. Of course, as you know, any risk to an organization is basically results in some kind of a reputational loss or a financial loss or impacts the operations, impacts the business. So we all know that every business has to deal with all kinds of risks. And how does some of the wrongs, it can add to data risk, and what's the impact of that? So for example, data governance. Every company should have data governance or data governance committee within the organization. And essentially, data governance is all about, yeah, you have lots of data, but how do you maximize the value of that data? How do you ensure that you have quality data? So data quality is very critical to the business. That impacts sales, cost, and the growth of the organization. For example, Nestle has to put the carbon emission information on every product label that they sell. If you go to, in Europe especially, if you go to buy the Nestle products, on the label, you will see information about carbon emission. And how do they get that information to put onto the label? They have to have the right data source. And that data source has to give them very accurate, timely data and very high quality data. If they don't have it, then they won't be able to put that information on the product label. And if they don't put it on the product label, then European Commission will, put fine on them. So that is how important it is to have the right data source, have the right quality of the data, and the data governance provides that opportunity for an organization to have the right data and the quality of data. And the other aspect of data governance is, we all have the concept of data ownership. In an organization, if you have certain kinds of data, who makes decisions with regards to that data? So it is a decision-making component as well within the data governance. So now think about all the bad things that can happen in this data governance component. Now, so that's why I have the title here, poor data governance can add to the data risk, which in turn adds to the business risk. So now moving on to the data mismanagement. So again, taking the hospital as an example, data can move from one workflow to the other, from one entity to the other, from one place to the other, from one application to the other. So we all know how data is utilized on a day-to-day basis within the business. Now, imagine things, errors happening when all these processes are in place. So lack of oversight when you acquire the data. For example, if you're acquiring too much data, and if you're acquiring sensitive data, you have to ask yourself, why are we acquiring this data? What's the legal basis of acquiring this data? And think of PCI compliance. If applications do not validate the data, now we don't know what comes into the application. And so things can go wrong when you don't validate the data. And when you validate data, you have right responses. So anyway, so the oversight can happen at every stage when acquiring, validating, and processing of the data. And errors can happen there without an oversight. And improper data recording, no data supervision, poor data maintenance, and data compliance issues. For example, think of having sensitive data beyond the retention period. So you are right away violating, probably one of the compliance requirements. And lack of synchronization. Imagine having data inaccurate or maybe different, maybe replicated, but not the same. And one application is referring to one set and the other application is referring to another set. Now think about all the things, all the wrong that can happen in such a scenario. So not to miss the inaccurate data. So if you have good data management, you will have the oversight. All these wrong, the errors won't happen, and you'll have good. You'll be performing good risk management around the data. So the second point basically says the data risk increases with data mismanagement. Lastly, protection of the data. So, this is sort of mostly familiar with most businesses compared to, in my experience, businesses still struggle with data governance and data management. And data security, to some extent, they do have something in place to protect the data. At least they're aware of it. There's some security awareness. So essentially, yeah, you have the data, you know what it is, you know where it is, you have the governance, you have the management. Now the question is, how do you ensure it is secure? How do you ensure that the confidentiality of the data is maintained? Integrity of the data is maintained. And how will you ensure that the data is available at the right time for the right person, for the right application, for the right system when it's needed? So the CIA triad is so critical when it comes to protecting the data. And of course, data can be at rest, wherever it is stored, data during processing, transmitting, sharing, within the organization, outside the organization. You have to be questioning, are they authorized to view this data? Are they authorized to receive this data? Do you have the agreements in place? What happens if the data that you share with the third party is not secure? So how is your due diligence in protecting this data? So Yad will go over the next few slides, talking about the impact of data breach and the losses and why it's important and so on. So Yad, over to you.
You've kind of really covered this, why DRM is important, haven't you, Mohan, in the piece you've done already. You talked about the importance of data governance and how you've got to put the right policies and processes in place. This slide talks a little bit about, why that's important, why you have to do that. Who cares if your data is properly protected? And of course, the reality is an awful lot of people do care. Customers care. Customers want to know that you're handling their personal data correctly. And if they feel that you're not, potentially there's a loss of trust issue with your customers, which can severely impact the business. So monetary losses are possible from customers feeling that their data is not being handled, as well as the fact that, of course, you could leave yourselves open to a data breach, which could deliver monetary loss as well. Litigation is an important issue. Brand erosion is an important issue. And of course, I think there are three constituencies or three groups of people who really do care. So number one is customers. They want to be sure that you're handling their personal data correctly. I think the second is industry regulators in certain industries. They want to know that personal data, private data, sensitive data is being handled in the right way. And PCI in the finance industry, in the payment card industry, is the perfect example of that. And then also governments want to be sure that individual and companies' private data is being handled in the right way as well, which is what's given rise to, privacy laws in more than 130 different countries around the world. We see GDPR is often seen as the gold standard for privacy laws in Europe, but there are many other privacy laws in many other countries that are looking to implement similar kinds of standards as well. So DRM is very important. It addresses all of those issues. So how do we kind of really go about doing it? So what I wanted to talk about was the steps to addressing DRM. And the first step really is knowing where all of your data is. And to be able to do that, you need data discovery tools and technologies. It's interesting, most organizations, if you push them, would probably admit to not knowing where all of their data exists, especially all of their sensitive or critical data. And until you do know, then you can't really begin to properly protect it and put the right processes, policies, procedures, tools in place to be able to protect it until you do. So interestingly, when we typically ask the question of a group of audience or a group of organizations and we poll them and we ask them how many of them know where all of their sensitive data exists across their variety of systems, networks, workstations, endpoints, and so on. The usual answer we get is somewhere around 70% of organizations admit to not knowing where all of their data is. And I think actually even the 30% who think that they do might be surprised if they were to fully scan their environment to find out just where some of that data actually does exist. So the first step is to identify and know where your data actually is. And as Mohan rightly was talking about earlier on, there are different types of data, and not all data is necessarily sensitive. When we think about PCI, obviously entities handling payment cards, for them, PCI data is very important and very sensitive. For other organizations, personally identifiable information is important, but then there's other critical and sensitive information as well. Maybe company classified information, product designs, or patent information, or maybe mergers and acquisitions data that you might have on your various different systems. All of those are going to be important. And in terms of understanding where those exist on your various different systems, that can often be like looking for a needle in a haystack, and doing it manually is a problem. So that's why we need some automated tools and technology to be able to help to find where that critical and sensitive data actually is. So that's step number one, identify where the data is. Once you've scanned your systems, then you should know where that data is, and then you have to decide how best to manage it. So this goes back to the procedures and policies and processes Mohan was talking about to effectively implement compliance requirements and regulatory requirements from different industry bodies. And that's going to be really important, because once you know where the data is, then you can start to properly protect it. And when it comes to data discovery tools and enterprise recon from Grand Labs in particular, as well as being able to help you manage that compliance and regulatory risk, the third thing we do, of course, is let you action or put right the issues around sensitive data, and that's often called remediation. So remediation is the process that you might want to go through to protect data that is sensitive from being used in the wrong way. And there are several ways you can do that. You can do what we call masking of data, where let's say, for example, you have a 16-digit credit card and that information is in a place where it shouldn't be used or shouldn't be accessed. Then you could mask it by covering up the middle characters or digits within the credit card number with hashes, for example. So that couldn't then be used again. And you can go further. As well as masking, you can delete that data. And what we're talking about here is a permanent, irretrievable delete of the data, so it couldn't be brought back later. You could encrypt the data, go further, encrypt the data with passwords and so on to make sure that only the right people actually do get access to it. Or before you do any of those things, you might actually decide to quarantine the data first. take that sensitive data, put it in a special location, and then decide how best to remediate that data. So it's really important when you're looking for sensitive data to be able to go through those steps. Identify where it is by scanning your systems, and that means scanning the broadest range of systems that you have on your network, endpoints and servers, for structured data and unstructured data. So by structured data, we're talking about data that typically exists in a database, nicely organized in rows and columns. You can do your queries on that data. But unstructured data, of course, is talking about files and folders on your hard drive, spreadsheets and Word documents, emails and attachments, all of that kind of data. And interestingly, as we've seen the amount of data grow over the last few years, unstructured data has overtaken structured data in the amount of data out there. So we need to be able to scan for both. So identifying where your data is, identifying where your sensitive data is the first step. Being able then to manage it based on the different risks that you're trying to address is the second step. And then being able to remediate it so that if the worst was to happen and your data, you were to have a data breach, for example, and that data might be taken by people who shouldn't get access to it, the fact that you've masked it or deleted it or encrypted it will make sure that even if they took that data, they wouldn't be able to use it, and you wouldn't suffer a loss because of that sensitive data being leaked outside of the organization. So those are the first three steps. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the changes in PCI DSS compliance that have been announced with version 4 of the PCI DSS standard earlier this year, and what that's going to mean for sensitive data and how we do PCI DSS compliance in the future. So I'm sure most of you will know, but PCI DSS version 4 of the standard was published at the end of March this year, and it's the most significant release in terms of what's being requested of entities who handle cardholder data since version 2.0 of the standard came out 12 years ago. And in previous releases, data discovery wasn't explicitly called out as a requirement, even though to handle many of the requirements of compliance, it would have been a useful tool. But actually, the Standards Council in this release have called out data discovery as a specific requirement in a number of areas of the standard, because they recognize that to be doing this manually is just too much of a task now. And one of the things that is driving that is the need to be able to revalidate your scope with your PCI DSS compliance program. Now, every entity, every merchant, every retailer has to revalidate their scope every 12 months. And that means identifying where all of the sensitive data, where all the cardholder data is, where it should be, making sure it doesn't go to places it shouldn't be held in, and so on. And for service providers, they have to revalidate their scope even more frequently now. They have to do it every 6 months. And for designated entities, they have to do it every 3 months. So instead of this being seen as an annual requirement that you have to go through, I think what the PCI Standards Council are actually getting towards is the idea that managing your data, understanding where it is, making sure it's properly protected with the right policies and procedures, and making sure it's in the right hands, the right people, is not just a once a year task that you have to go through now. It's the way you operate business all the way through the year, not just when it comes time to go through your compliance program. And that's why with a data discovery tool like Enterprise Recon, you can scan as often as you need. You could scan every week or every month to make sure that you're properly validating where your data exists, whether it's in scope or out of scope, whether it's being used in the right way, and whether, for example, when data is no longer required and no longer needed, that it is being effectively deleted. Mohan talked about that a little while ago. And one of the other things that PCI DSS 4 brings in is the idea of a customized approach, where for certain entities where some of the traditional rules may not have applied, they can come up with a different way of addressing the different requirements in the PCI DSS standard. And very often, to be able to understand those requirements and to show compliance, data discovery is going to be an important element. So PCI DSS 4 came out in March. Everybody's going to need to be working to this standard within 2 years. So that's by March 2024. And data discovery, I think, is really going to be a very important element in that. Yes, Mohan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, so if I just want to add a point to the description that you provided, I just wanted to emphasize the importance of discovery, data discovery and data scanning. So if some of you have performed the PCI DSS assessments, you all know how important scoping is. Scoping determines your cardholder data environment. So essentially, the centerpiece of PCI DSS compliance is the cardholder data environments, which means you're essentially saying, here's your environment, you have identified an environment, here's the boundary around the cardholder data. Now, ask yourself, what about other locations or unknown locations, unknown sources that is outside of what you have identified as cardholder data environment? Now, think about the cardholder data existing outside of what you think your CDE is. So without a good data discovery practice, you won't be able to know. So it is very critical to know where your data is, and that's where the basic piece of data risk management is data discovery. Just wanted to provide that emphasis here.
Thanks very much, Mohan. There's one final thing I just wanted to mention on this slide before I hand back to you for the next one. I think it dovetails nicely into what you're going to talk about next, is that for many governments and many organizations putting together privacy laws, payment card data today is seen as personally identifiable information, and as such needs to be handled as personally identifiable information for the sake of privacy laws. So we can't think of PCI data only in that context. We need to think of it in the broader context of customers' privacy data. And that leads me on kind of nicely to personally identifiable information and business critical data. Back to you, Mohan.
Thank you, Yad. So this slide talks about DRM in the context of PII and business critical data. So from a PII, which is personally identifiable information, essentially any combination of data, when put together, you can identify, you will know about the person. So that is the meaning behind PII. So for example, let's say maybe my email address is out there somewhere, but it's cryptic enough. Just by my email address, you won't be able to tell that that email address belongs to me. Now think of a database or a data source that you will come across, and that says my first name, last name, my email address, and other pieces of information. So if you could figure out who I am and where I live, and if you can target me for marketing purposes or other things, basically my PII has been exposed. And with that, probably additional PII, sensitive PII may also tag along with my basic PII. So just wanted to provide that intro on PII. And you may have heard about California privacy regulation, the CCPA, and the European regulation, GDPR, which is considered the gold standard for privacy. And we know that other states are also following in enacting the privacy laws. So it is critical to protect and manage the data subjects' privacy. So, as part of the compliance, one of the aspects of the privacy laws is the right of the data subject to ask you to delete the information, let's say. So what we call subject access request. You have to be able to delete it, or you have to be able to provide it in a portable manner so that the data subject can take the PII to another application, another entity. So there are certain basic rights that is provided by the privacy laws, and you should be able to incorporate that for the compliance. So now think about a scenario where PII exists in multiple applications, multiple locations, multiple departments, probably with your vendors. You don't know who has the PII that you collect. So the first question you should be asking, why am I collecting this? Do I have a legal basis to collect the PII? Where am I storing this? Where's the data source truth? Do I know all my locations that has the PII? So if you don't know where it is, how will you be able to process the subject access request in that context? So now again, data discovery and data governance and data management and security, all of them are so critical when it comes to PII. So now, yes, organizations can deal with PII because it is quite popular. There are organizations who ask this question: what is my business critical data? Is it just PII? What about intellectual property? What about some critical diagrams? What about critical product information? So your data classification. So I saw the poll results. It was sort of 50-50 whether you do the data classification or not. Data classification is extremely critical to understand how you can manage, govern, and secure that data. Is it public data? Is it private data? Is it restricted data? Is it confidential data? So if you're not able to classify your data, you will have difficulty managing it. So that's how important data classification is. So now when you do the data classification, when you do data management, when you know where your data is, now you're talking about identifying whether it's PII or business critical data. So what is critical data for you? Only you can answer that. So yeah, do you have any more to add to this?
I think the only thing I'd add is that in the kind of real world, what I've often seen is it's not uncommon for people to download large chunks of really what is personally identifiable information out of a CRM system or out of another system, export it so they can work on a spreadsheet and just not think about the implications of what they're doing. All of this data should only be processed for a correct reason. And part of PCI is being able to understand and articulate how data is being handled, for what reason, by whom, for how long, and what happens when the data is no longer needed. But actually, it's really common to see, VPs of sales, for example, download a chunk of their CRM data to work on it and do more analysis in Excel. But really, the data shouldn't be handled that way. And the only way you would know that that's going on is by using data discovery tools. So it's really important that this data is handled the right way, processed the right way, and that you do have proper visibility of the data to make sure that the procedures and policies you put in place are being enacted correctly.
All right, so thank you, Yad. Let's talk about cybersecurity. So one of the aspects, in the earlier slides, we said security of data is critical. And what does it mean by securing the data, and what do you have to do so that you can secure the data and that in turn reduces the data risk? So I'm going to continue the theme here about PCI. PCI is a great standard, data security standard. It provides a great prescription of how to apply cybersecurity components to ensure the data risk is lowered or minimized or removed. So if you take, you can choose, depending on what data you're dealing with, you can choose to implement a particular cybersecurity framework. But if you are talking about credit card holder data, of course, you have to be PCI DSS compliant, and you have to implement the PCI DSS standards. So any standard, of course, including PCI DSS, it provides you prescription on, starting with scoping. You scope your boundaries, scope your systems, You identify the environment that needs to be protected, that has the data, whether it's data at rest or transmitted or processed. And then how do you ensure the security of that network? How do you ensure your systems are secure? Your systems are hardened. It's fully securely configured. So, having a system not fully securely configured will open up to vulnerabilities that's open up to attacks. So security standard is all about, how do you prevent unauthorized access? How do you prevent attacks? How do you prevent threat actors from connecting or accessing your systems and in turn accessing the data? And so PCI DSS provides requirements that helps you to implement the security controls. For example, one such element is security awareness. It is such a critical control to have in every organization. As everyone knows, the weakest link is humans making errors. Either downloading or sharing, credit card data in plain text, in messaging, or clicking on that, phishing email asking people to send money and so on, and approving the money transfer. These things go on almost on a daily basis in various places. And if you have the right security awareness in place, then you can prevent all those errors. So security awareness is one component of PCI DSS standards. Similarly, you have to be performing periodic risk assessments. So you have to be asking yourself, what are the threats out there? And what are the weaknesses within our organization? And can that threat become a reality? How likely is the threat becoming a reality? And what do we need to do about it? What are the risks? Is it a high risk probability or is it very low risk? So you have to be performing risk assessments. So all these elements, knowing the data, classifying the data, protecting the data, putting the security controls around this data. So it's, these are all the cybersecurity aspects that goes towards meeting the data risk management goals. Yeah.
Sure, there you go.
So I can talk a little bit about, how do you minimize the data risk? And of course, we touched on the security portion of it. So the first, from a PCI point of view, the best way to be PCI compliant is don't store cardholder data. Just, you don't need it. If you need it for whatever business reason, then you have to think about securing that and then implementing those security controls. So ensure that you have the data governance, ensure that you have the data management, ensure that you have the data security, ensure that your data is within fewer locations, know where it is, what those locations are, ensure that there are no duplications, ensure the inventory of those locations, ensure, without saying it's a data classification. And another aspect is data anonymization. In the case of PII, yes, of course you can have the PII if you manage in such a way that most of the access is performed on an anonymized data for say research purposes, then the risk is very, very low. So you can separate the person from the person's data. So for example, marketing. Marketing need not really know everything about an individual, but marketing wants to know, the demographics, all the metadata around the individual's preferences and so on, so that they can do the market research. So that's one area where you can implement, have the anonymized data and use it within your business. So just a few pieces of information there in terms of how you can reduce the data risk by performing DRM at your organization.
I think there's one phrase I'd throw in here as well, Mohan, that we often talk about, and it's ROT, R-O-T, redundant, obsolete, or out of date data and trivial data. You talked earlier on about having, data being very valuable, and you wanted to have one version of the truth. Well, of course, as soon as you make a copy of a piece of data, then you've got two versions of the data, and which version is the correct version of the data. So you really don't want to be holding copies of the data if you don't need to. And what often happens is people will take copies of the data, go away and work on it, and then forget about it. And it will be left on a system somewhere, on a file server somewhere or something. And it's exactly that kind of data that could be exposed were a security breach to happen. So it's really important that any data like that, firstly, is identified, secondly, is remediated, so that should it ever be exposed, it wouldn't be an issue. So being able to eliminate redundant, obsolete, and trivial data is very important to leave you with the data that's correct, the data that does provide the single version of the truth.
All right, so continuing the theme of compliance and risk assessments, just a little overview on how do you do that, and what are some of the important aspects of that. So first, yes, emphasizing the data discovery, knowing the data, performing the data risk classification, understanding your data. You know, how important is it? How critical is it? How important it is to protect that data? How important it is to prevent the unauthorized access on such data. So that you can only do that if you perform data risk classification. And once you discover, once you perform the classification, now you can get to the next step of scoping. So now you know, let's say PCI DSS auditor comes in and says, I want to see the scope. So you can say, okay, here's our enclave that holds this critical data, and everything else is out of scope because that out of scope environment does not have the critical data that we're talking about. So it becomes easier for you to perform the scoping. And once you have that, now you're talking about, you know, the most important aspect of any compliance is policies. So everything is top down. If you don't have good security policies, then you cannot perform good data governance, you cannot have good data security, and so on. So the senior management has to approve of these policies, and everybody should be aware of these policies. And only then you can implement those policies and ensure that the policies are deployed across the organization. And that's how critical the policies are. And then performing the risk assessment. So now that you know your scope, your environment, now you have to know what are the risks here. Is it really secure? Is the risk completely reduced? So understanding your risks is important. So in other words, you got to do your analysis of your threats, your vulnerabilities, the likelihood, the impact, and understand the risks and classify the risks. And once you do that, now you know where the gaps are, perform the gap analysis. So yeah, we are good on security awareness. Well, we are not good on patch management. Or we are good on patch management, but we're not good on account management. We don't know how many accounts we have. We don't know who's accessing it. We don't know why they have the access. So by performing this, you know where the gaps are and what you need to do. So now we're talking about controls implementation or remediation of those gaps. So ensure that you have the controls in place. And once you have that, yes, of course, you're compliant, but most importantly, as Yad mentioned, it is not a one snapshot or one assessment within a certain period, but it is a continuous compliance and monitoring, which is even more critical when it comes to compliance and risk assessments. Yad?
Yeah, I think I would just finish by summarizing and saying that really the first step is to understand where your data is, be able to identify it, because until you do that, you can't effectively protect it. But once you have identified where your data is, then all of the steps that are on this slide that Mohan has been talking about, all the policies and protections that you want to put in place can be done because you have a sound basis on which to do that. So identify your data first, then decide how you want to protect it and how you want to put those policies in. And then just to echo what Mohan finished off by saying is, don't treat this as a one-off project that you have to do. It has to be a continuous cycle of being able to understand your current situation. And if you do it that way, then it becomes a virtuous circle where not only is your data protected in the most effective way, you've got the right governance, you've got the right protections in place, but you can identify when those things aren't right and fix them very quickly. One of the most interesting stats I've seen recently about data breaches is that most organizations didn't identify their data breach for, on average, 288 days. And that's quite scary, really, in that you could have been breached but not known about it. What you need to be able to do with the right implementation of these tools is to protect your data and know when those protections are at risk. And that's really what we're able to do. Okay. Nico, you're going to come back in with the questions. Have there been any questions for us?
Yes, I do see we have a couple questions in here, so I could direct it to you. The first one reads, does RSI Security or Grand Labs provide data governance assessments? Once an initial assessment is done, does RSI or Grand Labs provide a data governance managed service that would supplement a small business environment that might not have the resources to carry that resource in-house?
One for you, Mohan, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Nico. Thank you for the question. RSI, it's a cybersecurity professional services company. We provide cybersecurity advisory and we perform compliance assessments and audits on various frameworks. We also provide risk assessment services. We also provide testing services. And another example is, let's say if your organization needs incident response planning, we can help you with that. Let's say you have an incident response plan and you say, we don't know whether our incident response plan is good enough, so we can perform tabletop testing. So going back to the question, RSI does not provide all the components of a data risk management, particularly around data management and data governance, but definitely if it comes to security and compliance, data security compliance, yes, RSI is the organization to come to.
Awesome. Then I see we have another one here. Does Grand Lab scan both on-premise and cloud? Also, can you scan Salesforce data?
Okay, I'll take that one. So the short answer is yes, Grand Labs can do data discovery both on-premise and the cloud. And one of those places we can search for data is in Salesforce. Absolutely, that's correct. That's the short answer. I think the long answer is that what you're needing when you're looking for sensitive data is to be able to scan the widest number of places where that data could exist. So that means the largest number of endpoints, whether they be Windows workstations or Mac workstations or Linux workstations, the largest number of servers where all the data exists, the largest number of databases on those servers for structured data, and then also the largest number of unstructured data sources. And that can include file stores, email servers, and anywhere else that you might have data. Our goal with data discovery is to leave no stone unturned, to be able to search pretty much everywhere so that you can be confident that if there is sensitive data stored in your organization, that you can identify it, know exactly why it's there, what it's there for, and remediate it if necessary to make sure it's not a security risk.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Yad. Looks like we have another question here. Does Grand Labs have a local US team?
Yes, absolutely. So we have a sales organization and support organization in the US. And obviously we work with our partners like RSI Security to provide these services as part of a more complete offering that they are able to provide as well.
Thank you for that. Looks like we have another question coming in here. how do you price a vCISO service? Is it based on the number of users in the organization?
Yeah, I can answer that. At RSI, we provide a couple of few flavors of vCISO services. For example, organizations come to us and say, we have a security team, we have a security program, but we need ongoing CISO advisory service, such as helping with the governance, address the board, and ensure the team is performing continuous security and monitoring, ensure that our policy procedures are okay. So ensure the security program is working the way it should be, and ensure that incident response plan is working the way it should be. So that could be a T&M, let's say, a few hours a day, or a few hours a week, or a few hours a month. So depending on the needs of the organization, you can avail of the vCISO services. So there's another aspect of vCISO services where it's a turnkey service, where you can have a CISO come in and set up your program, set up your complete security program from start to finish. Let's say you don't have policies and procedures. Let's say you don't have security implementation. You haven't picked up framework. You haven't done the scoping. You haven't. So essentially understanding the security needs and creating a security program. And that's also another way to use the vCISO services. So it's about complexity of the environment, how many locations you have, how big is the organization, how many users, how many systems, how many networks, how does your organization look like? So definitely it's not just the number of users alone. There are other risk factors that we add to identify the complexity for a service such as vCISO.
Thank you so much for that, Mohan. All right. It doesn't look like there are any more questions. I'll give it a couple more seconds here if anyone wants to submit an additional one. All right. Well, at this point, it looks like there are no other questions. So we would just like to thank our partners at Ground Labs so much for joining us today. Oh, sorry, looks like we just had one more pop in. Do you offer SIM and SOAR, SOAR?
So if it's a question to RSI, yes, RSI provides SIM services. I am not too familiar with SOAR, so you may have to explain to me what it is.
Security orchestration, automation, and response.
Yeah, I would say yeah, I would say no. Definitely the SIM, yes. The SOAR, no. So probably we'll have a better answer next time you talk to us.
Awesome. All right, I'll give it a couple more seconds here if anyone has an additional question they want to throw in. All right. Looks like that just about finalizes it. So yeah, thank you so much for our partners at Ground Labs. Yad, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Mohan, and as well as everyone else that joined us in the audience today. We'll be in touch via email tomorrow with a recording of the presentation, as well as the presentation slides and your CPE certificate. So everyone have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much,
Thank you all.
everybody.
Thank you, Yad.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.